Francesca had lived in the apartment across from mine for 2 years, and I could count on one hand how many times she'd actually spoken to me, mostly just tight nods in the hallway, the kind that said, "I see you exist, but let's not make this a thing." So when she stopped me on Saturday morning outside my door and asked if that guy in the black jacket had found me yet, I just stood there with my grocery bags trying to process what she was even talking about. What guy? She shifted her weight and explained that someone had been hanging around the building yesterday afternoon, knocking on doors and asking which apartment was mine. He'd described me specifically. Brown hair, early 20s, drives the silver Lexus in spot 47. When he got to her door, she'd told him she didn't know anything because that's what you tell random strangers asking about your neighbors. But she thought I should probably know someone was looking for me that specifically. I thanked her and she disappeared back into her apartment before I could ask anything else. I stood there in the hallway trying to figure out who would send someone to find me, instead of just texting or calling like a normal person. My mom hadn't mentioned sending anyone. My dad lived 3 states away in Ohio, and definitely would have told me if he'd hired some kind of courier service or whatever. I called my brother Reggie on my way inside and he laughed, told me I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a delivery guy who couldn't find the right apartment and gave up. But delivery guys don't describe you physically. They have a tracking number and an address. They leave the package at the office or by your door and they move on to the next stop. I texted Cassandra because we'd been planning to meet up that afternoon anyway. She responded almost immediately saying it was actually weird I'd brought that up. She'd seen someone matching that exact description outside the CVS near campus on Thursday. A guy in a black jacket just standing by the entrance like he was waiting for someone, but not really looking at his phone or doing anything, just watching people come and go. She'd noticed him because he'd been there for at least 20 minutes while she was shopping and was still there when she left. She hadn't thought much about it until right now. The CVS was 6 blocks from my apartment. It wasn't on the way to anywhere I regularly went. You don't just end up standing outside a random CVS for 20 minutes unless you're waiting for something specific. I asked what else she remembered about him. She said average height, maybe early 30s, dark hair, nothing that stood out about his face, but he had this way of standing. Really still, really focused, that made her think he was looking for someone in particular. She'd figured it was some weird dating app meetup situation and forgotten about it. 2 sightings in 2 days. Both in places I actually went to regularly. Both matching the same description. I called Reggie back and told him this wasn't me being paranoid anymore. He got serious fast and mentioned that he'd actually noticed a car he didn't recognize parked across from his house yesterday. Dark blue or black sedan with tinted windows. But he'd assumed it was someone visiting the neighbors. Now he wasn't so sure. He told me to stay inside, keep my doors locked, and he'd drive up from Frederick tomorrow morning to figure this out with me. I couldn't just sit there doing nothing. I pulled up my blinds just enough to angle myself so I could see the parking lot without being obvious about it, and I waited. For about 40 minutes, I saw nothing except normal Saturday afternoon activity. Mrs. Flores from Building C walking her ancient beagle, 2 teenagers doing tricks on skateboards by the mailboxes, someone loading furniture into a U-Haul. Then I saw him. Black jacket, dark jeans, hands shoved in his pockets, standing near the dumpster enclosure like he had every right to be there. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't doing anything except watching my building with this patient, measured focus that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my keys and my phone and went downstairs before I could talk myself out of it. The smart thing would have been to call the police, but what would I even say? There's a man standing near the dumpsters? He hasn't done anything illegal. He's just there. When I came through the side entrance, he turned toward me like he'd been expecting exactly this. Like he'd been waiting for me to come to him. I kept about 20 feet of distance between us. "You've been asking about me," I said. "So here I am. What do you want?" He didn't move closer, just tilted his head slightly and told me he was looking for someone and he thought I might be able to help him find her. He had this calm, reasonable way of talking that somehow made the whole situation feel even more wrong. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. He explained that the woman he was looking for had gone off the grid about 7 months ago, that her ex-boyfriend was getting increasingly concerned about her well-being and had hired him to locate her. He described her in detail. Short dark hair, mid-20s, petite build, small tattoo of a hummingbird on her left wrist. He said he'd tracked her digital footprint as far as Baltimore and that my name had come up more than once in his research. He seemed to think I might know where she was staying. "I've never seen anyone like that," I said, even though my hands were shaking. He smiled, not friendly, just acknowledging that I was lying, and pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. He told me the ex-boyfriend was offering a substantial finder's fee for information leading to her current address. Enough money to make it very much worth my while. All I had to do was call the number on the card when I changed my mind about cooperating. I didn't take the card. He placed it carefully on the ground between us, stepped back, and walked toward the dark sedan parked on the street. He drove away without looking back. I waited until his car disappeared around the corner. Then I went back inside, locked every lock on my door, and grabbed the burner phone from my desk drawer, the one I'd bought 7 months ago for emergencies I desperately hoped would never actually happen, and dialed the only number saved in it. She picked up on the second ring. "Annette, listen to me. He's coming. Grab what you can and disappear. Tonight." "What happened?" Annette's voice came out barely above a whisper. 7 months ago, she'd shown up at my door at 2 a.m. with a split lip, a black eye that was already swelling shut, and a backpack containing everything she owned that mattered. Her boyfriend Kyle had put her in the hospital twice in the past year. Once for a broken wrist he'd claimed was from her tripping on the stairs. Once for cracked ribs he'd said happened when she fell during an argument. She'd finally decided she was done waiting around for him to actually kill her. I'd driven her to the Greyhound station at 4 a.m, given her $1,200 in cash that I'd been saving for a security deposit on a better apartment, and watched her board a bus heading west. She'd promised to text me when she got somewhere safe. She'd promised to start over somewhere Kyle would never think to look for her. Kyle had just sent someone to bring her back. He'd found me, which meant he was close to finding her. "Pack tonight," I told her. "Don't wait until morning." She asked where she was supposed to go. She'd been working at a diner in Pittsburgh under a fake name, living in a room she rented week to week from someone who didn't ask questions. She'd finally started to feel like maybe she could breathe again, like maybe she could build something that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder. "I don't know yet," I said, "but he knows about me. He described you perfectly, including the tattoo. He's not giving up." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Annette said something that made my blood run cold. She said she wasn't running anymore. Update: I'm not running anymore. That's what Annette said to me on the phone, and I legitimately thought she'd lost her mind. I told her she didn't understand. This guy knew what she looked like. He knew about the tattoo. Kyle was actively hunting for her, and she needed to disappear again immediately. She went quiet for a second and then said she understood perfectly. She'd spent 7 months changing her hair color every 6 weeks, working cash-only jobs under fake names, sleeping in rooms rented from people who didn't ask questions. She was exhausted, she was broke, and she was done letting Kyle control her life even when he wasn't physically standing in front of her. I tried explaining that this wasn't about pride or control, this was about staying alive. But she cut me off and said she was already on the road. She'd left Pittsburgh 2 hours ago and would be at my apartment by midnight. She what? I started freaking out because if Kyle's PI had tracked her to my city, to my name specifically, then my apartment was literally the worst place she could come. But Annette said that was exactly the point. She was tired of hiding. She wanted to deal with this head-on, and she needed my help to do it. When she finally showed up, it was almost 1 a.m, and she looked completely different from the last time I'd seen her. Her hair was shoulder-length and blonde now instead of the short, dark cut she'd had when she left. She'd gained some weight back. The kind of weight you gain when you're not living in constant stress and fear. She looked healthy, strong. Nothing like the broken girl who'd shown up at my door 7 months ago. We sat in my living room and I made coffee even though neither of us needed caffeine at that hour. I needed something to do with my hands while she explained what she was thinking. She said Kyle had already taken 2 years of her life. 2 years where she couldn't see her friends without him interrogating her afterward. Couldn't work because he said it made him look bad if his girlfriend needed a job. Couldn't make any decision without his approval. She'd lost herself completely in those 2 years, and she'd spent the last 7 months trying to find herself again. She wasn't giving him any more time. "So what's your plan?" I asked. Because hoping he'll just give up and leave you alone isn't a plan, it's wishful thinking. Annette pulled out her old phone, the one she'd left behind when she ran. She said she'd been keeping the account active, paying the bill every month with a prepaid card she bought with cash. She'd never turned it on because she knew the second she did, Kyle would be able to track it. But now she wanted him to find her. On her terms, not his. I stared at her like she was speaking another language. "You want to use yourself as bait?" She said it wasn't bait. It was taking back control. She'd turn on the phone, let him see she was in Baltimore, and force a confrontation in a public place where he couldn't touch her without witnesses. She wanted to look him in the face and tell him she was done, that she was filing for a protective order, that if he came near her again, she'd make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person he was. "This is how people get killed," I told her. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop a man who put you in the hospital twice?" She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen on her before. Determined, almost fierce. She said maybe it wouldn't stop him, but at least she'd stop running. At least she'd face him on her feet instead of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to put her back in my car and drive her somewhere even further away. But I also knew that look. I'd seen it once before. The night she'd shown up at my door deciding she was finally leaving. Once Annette made up her mind about something, there was no talking her out of it. I told her I needed to think about this and she should get some sleep. She crashed on my couch and I went to my bedroom, but I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that PI standing by the dumpsters, about the way he'd smiled when I lied to him, about how he'd known exactly what Annette looked like down to a tattoo most people wouldn't even notice. Around 7 in the morning, my phone rang. Reggie. I answered and immediately knew something was wrong from his voice. That guy came to my house, he said. My entire body went cold. What? Reggie explained that someone matching the PI's description had knocked on his door yesterday evening. When Reggie opened it, the guy had smiled all friendly and asked if he knew where his sister was. Reggie had told him I was fine and it was none of his business. The guy's smile had disappeared and he'd said he wasn't asking about me. He was asking about the girl I was helping hide from her boyfriend. Reggie had told him to get off his property. The guy had taken a step back, but before leaving, he'd mentioned that interfering with someone's relationship, helping a woman run away from her partner, could have serious consequences. Not just for me, but for my whole family. He'd made a point of mentioning that Reggie had 2 kids, 6 and 8 years old, and it would be a shame if this situation affected them. I felt like I was going to be sick. Kyle was threatening my brother's kids now. He was dragging my entire family into this because I'd helped someone escape him. Reggie was pissed. He wanted to file a police report, wanted to drive up to Baltimore immediately and help me figure this out. I told him to stay home with his family and lock his doors, and I'd call him back. When I came out of my bedroom, Annette was already awake, sitting on the couch looking at her old phone like it was a bomb. She asked if I was okay, and I told her what Reggie had said. Her face went white. This is exactly why I need to face him, she said. Because Kyle isn't going to stop. He'll keep escalating, keep threatening anyone connected to me until he gets what he wants. The only way to end this is to confront it directly. Or you could disappear completely, I said. Change your name legally, move somewhere he'd never think to look, actually start over instead of putting yourself in danger. She stood up and started pacing around my living room. She said she'd thought about that constantly for 7 months. But running forever meant never using her real name, never having a real job with benefits or a future, never reconnecting with her own family because Kyle had convinced them she was unstable and dramatic. It meant living half a life indefinitely. She was done with that. Before I could respond, Cassandra showed up. I'd texted her the night before about Annette being here and she'd taken the morning off work to come over. When she walked in and saw both of us, she immediately asked what happened because apparently we both looked terrible. I explained everything. The PI at my building, him going to Reggie's house, Annette's plan to turn on her phone and force a confrontation with Kyle. Cassandra sat down heavily on my couch and asked if Annette had lost her mind. Finally, someone with sense, I said. But then Cassandra surprised me. She asked what Annette was planning exactly. Not whether she should do it, but how. Annette explained she wanted to meet Kyle somewhere public. Lots of people, security cameras, witnesses. She wanted to tell him face-to-face that she was filing for a protective order, and that if he continued harassing her or anyone connected to her, she'd go to the police with everything. Photos of her injuries from when they were together, hospital records, witness statements from neighbors who'd heard them fighting. You kept evidence? Cassandra asked. Annette nodded. She said she'd been documenting things for the last year of their relationship. Not because she'd planned to leave, but because Kyle had convinced her she was crazy, and she'd needed proof that she wasn't imagining how bad things were. She had photos on an old laptop she'd left at her mom's house. She had medical records. She had text messages where Kyle had apologized after hurting her, promising it would never happen again. So you do have leverage, Cassandra said. I interrupted and said it didn't matter how much evidence she had if Kyle showed up and killed her in a parking lot. This wasn't a legal negotiation. This was a dangerous man who didn't follow normal rules. Cassandra looked at me and said that was exactly why we needed to be there with her. Not to fight Kyle physically, but to be witnesses, to record everything, to make sure he couldn't do anything without it being documented and seen. I asked. She said obviously she wasn't letting Annette do this alone. If Annette was set on confronting Kyle, then we needed to make sure it happened as safely as possible. Public location, multiple witnesses, phones ready to record and call 911 if needed. I looked back and forth between them like they'd both gone insane. This is the worst idea I've ever heard. But even as I said it, I knew I wasn't going to let Annette do this alone either. She'd come to me 7 months ago because she'd had nowhere else to go. I'd helped her leave because it was the right thing to do. If she was determined to face Kyle now, I couldn't just abandon her. What followed was the most surreal planning session of my life. 3 women sitting around my coffee table on a Sunday morning trying to figure out the safest way to confront an abusive ex-boyfriend. Cassandra pulled up her laptop and started researching Maryland protective order procedures. Annette made a list of everything she had for evidence. I mostly sat there feeling like we were planning something that was going to get us all hurt, or worse. Annette wanted to do it Tuesday. Give herself 1 day to prepare mentally, then turn on her phone Monday night and send Kyle a message with a time and location. Where? Cassandra asked. We debated this for almost an hour. Mall parking lot. Too isolated in certain areas. Police station parking lot. Kyle might not show up. Restaurant. Too many civilians who could get caught in the middle if things went wrong. Finally, Cassandra suggested the giant grocery store. Huge parking lot. Constantly busy. Security cameras everywhere. Security guard usually visible near the entrance. Public enough that Kyle couldn't do anything without being seen, but not so crowded that innocent people would be in immediate danger. Annette agreed. Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon, middle of the day, lots of shoppers coming and going. I asked what she was even going to say to him. You can't just walk up and hand him legal papers, you don't even have them yet. She said she'd tell him the truth, that she was done running, that she was staying in Baltimore, that she was filing for a protective order, and if he contacted her again or came near her, she was going straight to the police with everything she had on him. She'd tell him to leave her alone and go back to Louisville. And you think he'll just agree? I asked. Annette looked at me and said no. She thought he'd be furious. She thought he'd yell and make threats and try to intimidate her like he always did. But for the first time, she'd have witnesses. She'd have people standing next to her who saw exactly how he treated her. She'd have proof that she wasn't the crazy, dramatic girlfriend he'd always told her she was. Cassandra asked if Annette's parents knew any of this. Annette's face changed and she said her parents hadn't spoken to her in almost 8 months. Kyle had called them after she left and told them she'd had some kind of breakdown, that she'd become unstable and violent, that he was worried about her mental health. Her mom had actually called her mom's sister and asked if Annette had seemed off lately, if there was a history of mental illness in the family she didn't know about. This made me even more convinced this was a terrible idea, but Annette was set on it. She turned on her old phone Monday evening while we all sat in my living room holding our breath. Within minutes, the messages started coming through. Dozens of them, all from Kyle, sent over the past 7 months. The first few were worried. Annie, where are you? I'm scared something happened. Please just let me know you're okay. Then they got angry. You can't just disappear like this. We need to talk about what you did. You're being selfish and childish. Then they turned manipulative. I know you're confused right now, but I forgive you. Come home and we'll work through this together. I miss you so much. The most recent ones from the past 2 weeks were different, colder. I know you're in Baltimore. I know who you've been talking to. You can't hide from this forever. We will talk, whether you want to or not. Annette's hands were shaking as she read through them. Then she opened a new message and typed, Giant on Reisterstown Road, Tuesday 3 p.m. Come alone and we'll talk. Don't come alone and I'm going to the police. She hit send before any of us could say anything. His response came through in less than 30 seconds. Finally ready to stop playing games? I'll be there. That was it. No questions, no negotiation, just confirmation that he'd show up. Cassandra looked at me and I looked at Annette and none of us said anything for a long minute. Then Annette turned off the phone again and said she needed to sleep. After she went to bed, Cassandra stayed for another hour. We sat in my kitchen whispering about how insane this was, how many ways it could go wrong, whether we should try harder to talk Annette out of it. But we both knew she was doing it regardless of what we said. Cassandra asked if I'd told Reggie. I said no because he'd drive up here and try to physically stop this from happening. She said maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing. I said Annette deserved to make her own choices even if they scared the hell out of us. Tuesday morning, I could barely function. I called out sick from my job because there was no way I could focus on scheduling appointments while knowing what was happening that afternoon. Annette was weirdly calm. She showered, ate breakfast, spent time going through her evidence folder making sure she had everything organized. Around 2, we all got in my car and drove to the Giant. We parked near the entrance where the security cameras had the best angle. Annette wanted to stand by the cart return area where there was open space but still lots of foot traffic. Cassandra and I positioned ourselves about 15 feet away, close enough to intervene if needed but not so close that Kyle would immediately focus on us. At 2:55, a dark blue sedan pulled into the parking lot. Different car from the one the PI had been driving, but I knew immediately it was Kyle. He parked 3 spaces away from us and sat in his car for a minute before getting out. And that's when I saw him for the first time. He looked so normal, like someone you'd see at Target or waiting in line at Starbucks. Medium height, decent haircut, wearing jeans, and a nice button-down shirt. He smiled when he saw Annette. Actually smiled like they were old friends meeting up for coffee. He walked right up to her, and I swear to God he tried to hug her. Last update. Okay, so first, to everyone who said I should have called the cops before meeting Kyle, that we were idiots for doing this in a parking lot, that this was going to end badly. You were kind of right, but also you don't understand what it's like when someone has controlled every aspect of your friend's life for years. Annette needed this confrontation. She needed to face him on her own terms for once. So Kyle tried to hug Annette and she stepped back so fast she almost tripped. "Don't touch me," she said, loud enough that a woman loading groceries into her car nearby actually looked over at us. Kyle put his hands up like he was surrendering, that same friendly smile still on his face. He said he just wanted to talk, that he'd been so worried about her, that he was glad she finally reached out so they could work through this like adults. The way he said it, so calm and reasonable, made my skin crawl, because I knew what he was really like. Annette told him there was nothing to work through. She was here to tell him to leave her alone, to stop sending people to harass her friends and their families, to accept that their relationship was over and had been over for 7 months. That's when his expression changed. He said 7 months where she'd completely abandoned him without explanation, made him look like a fool in front of everyone they knew, refused to answer his calls or texts like a mature person. He said he'd been patient. He'd given her space to calm down from whatever episode she'd been having, but enough was enough. Episode, Annette repeated. "You put me in the hospital, Kyle." He actually laughed. Said here we go with the dramatics again, that she'd always had a flair for exaggeration. He told her she'd gotten hurt because she'd come at him during an argument, that he'd been defending himself when she fell. He said if she'd just learned to control her temper instead of getting physical whenever she was upset, none of that would have happened. I watched Annette's face and I could see her starting to doubt herself, starting to second-guess her own memories because that's what he did to her for 2 years, made her question her own reality. So I stepped forward and said we had the hospital records, we had photos, we had documentation of everything. Kyle finally looked at me directly, asked who I was again and why I was involving myself in a private conversation between him and his girlfriend. I told him Annette wasn't his girlfriend, hadn't been for 7 months, and I was involved because he'd sent someone to threaten my family. He said he hadn't threatened anyone. He'd simply hired a professional to locate his girlfriend who'd disappeared without warning. If that professional had spoken to people during his investigation, that was just standard procedure. He said I was being paranoid and dramatic, just like Annette, and maybe we'd been spending too much time together feeding each other's delusions. Cassandra spoke up then and said she'd been there too. She'd seen the bruises. She'd heard Annette crying on the phone after he'd hurt her. Kyle turned to her with this look of fake concern and asked if we'd considered that maybe Annette needed professional help, that sometimes people who are struggling mentally can be very convincing when they're telling their version of events. That's when Annette lost it. She started yelling at him right there in the parking lot, asking how he could stand there and lie like that, asking if he actually believed his own bullshit at this point. She said she had proof, photos of bruises, medical records, text messages where he'd apologized for hurting her. She said she was filing for a protective order, and if he came near her again, she'd make sure everyone in Louisville knew exactly what kind of person he was. Kyle's whole demeanor shifted then. The friendly, reasonable act completely dropped, and what was underneath was ugly. He stepped closer to her, not quite threatening, but definitely intimidating, and said she wasn't filing anything. He said if she tried to make any of this public, he'd make sure everyone knew she was unstable, that she'd abandoned her family and responsibilities, that she'd been sleeping around and lying about it. He said her own parents already thought she was having a breakdown. How hard would it be to convince everyone else? People were definitely watching us now. An older couple had stopped pushing their cart to stare. The woman who'd been loading groceries was on her phone. I couldn't tell if she was calling someone or just pretending not to eavesdrop. Annette didn't back down though. She said, "Go ahead. Tell everyone whatever you want." She was done caring what people thought. She was done letting him control her through fear and manipulation. She was done with all of it. Kyle grabbed her arm. He said they were going to go somewhere private and talk about this properly, that she was making a scene and embarrassing herself. He started trying to pull her toward his car. I didn't even think. I just moved forward and shoved him. Actually physically shoved him hard enough that he stumbled back and let go of Annette's arm. I told him to get his hands off her. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and asked if I'd just assaulted him. Asked if I realized that was illegal, that there were witnesses, that he could have me arrested right now. Cassandra stepped between us and said actually there were witnesses to him grabbing Annette against her will, and that security cameras probably caught the whole thing. She said maybe we should go inside the store and talk to security about what just happened. Kyle said this was ridiculous, that he was trying to have a private conversation with his girlfriend and we were harassing him. He told Annette they'd finish this discussion later when she didn't have her friends interfering. Annette said no. They wouldn't finish it later because there was nothing to finish. She was staying in Baltimore, she was filing for a protective order, and if he contacted her again in any way, she was going to the police with everything she had. She said it clearly and firmly, and I was so proud of her in that moment. Kyle stared at her for a long minute. Then he said fine, if that's how she wanted to play this. He said she'd regret making an enemy out of him, that she had no idea what he was capable of when someone crossed him. He said he'd been nice so far, patient, understanding, but if she wanted to do this the hard way, they could do it the hard way. He got in his car and drove away. A security guard finally came over and asked if everything was okay, if we needed him to call the police. Cassandra explained that a man had grabbed her friend and we'd intervened. And could we please see the security footage to document what happened? The guard said he'd need to talk to his manager, but he'd seen the end of it, and he could confirm someone had grabbed someone else. We went inside and spent the next hour dealing with store security and eventually the police. A couple of officers showed up and took statements from all of us, from the security guard, from the woman who'd been on her phone. She'd actually been recording video of the whole thing and sent it to the cops. They said they couldn't arrest Kyle based on what happened, but they could file a report, and it would help Annette's case if she filed for a protective order, which she did. The next day, we went to the courthouse and Annette filed the paperwork. The clerk explained it would take a few days or weeks to process, and then there'd be a hearing where Kyle would have the opportunity to contest it. Annette said she understood and she'd be there. Now here's the part that's going to sound crazy, but I swear it's true. Someone commented asking if Kyle's family knew what he was like, and that actually made me realize something I should have thought of before. Annette had mentioned once that Kyle's mom had died when he was young and his dad had remarried. She'd met his stepmom a few times and said the woman had seemed scared of Kyle's dad, always trying to keep the peace, always apologizing for things that weren't her fault. I asked Annette about it and she went quiet. Then she said Kyle's dad used to hit his stepmom. Kyle had told her about it once when he was drunk, said his dad kept her in line and maybe that's what women needed sometimes, someone strong enough to handle them. At the time, Annette had been too scared to really process what he was saying. Now it made horrible sense. Kyle had learned this from his dad. He'd watched his father abuse his stepmother and decided that's what relationships looked like. That's what he thought was normal. This made everything feel even more impossible because how do you fight against something someone learned from childhood? How do you make someone understand that what they're doing is wrong when they literally watched their parent do the same thing their whole life? But Annette said that's exactly why she couldn't back down. Because if Kyle got away with this, if he found another girlfriend after her, he'd do the exact same thing to that person, and to the person after that. Someone had to stand up and say, no, this isn't okay, this isn't normal, this ends here. The protective order hearing was set for the following week. Kyle showed up with a lawyer, an actual lawyer in a suit who immediately started talking about how this was a misunderstanding, that his client had simply been trying to communicate with his ex-girlfriend, that any physical contact had been minimal and non-threatening. He said Annette had abandoned the relationship without explanation, and Kyle had been worried about her mental health. Annette's voice shook when she spoke, but she didn't back down. She told the judge about the hospital visits, about the bruises and broken bones, about the constant surveillance and control. She submitted the photos she'd kept, the medical records, the text messages. She explained about the PI showing up at my apartment, about the threats made to my brother's family. Kyle sat there looking calm and reasonable the whole time. His lawyer kept objecting, kept trying to paint Annette as unstable and vindictive. He said she'd been struggling with mental health issues during their relationship, that Kyle had tried to get her help, that she'd refused treatment and become increasingly erratic. The judge looked at the evidence, looked at the photos of bruises in the shape of handprints, the hospital record documenting cracked ribs, asked Kyle's lawyer to explain those. The lawyer said arguments sometimes became physical when both parties lost their tempers, that his client deeply regretted any time things had escalated, but that didn't make him an abuser. He said Annette had been just as aggressive during their fights. I was sitting in the gallery next to Cassandra and I wanted to scream. The way this lawyer was twisting everything, making it sound like Annette had been equally responsible for her own abuse, was making me physically sick. But then the judge asked Kyle directly, "Did you or did you not put your hands on the petitioner in the giant parking lot last week?" Kyle said he'd touched her arm because she was being irrational and he'd been trying to calm her down. He said he'd been gentle and appropriate and her friends had completely overreacted. The judge pulled up the video on her computer, the one the woman in the parking lot had taken. She watched it twice. Then she looked at Kyle and said that didn't look like someone trying to calm anyone down. It looked like someone trying to force someone into their car against their will. She granted the protective order, temporary for now with a full hearing scheduled in 30 days, but effective immediately. Kyle was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Annette at all times, no contact of any kind, no third parties acting on his behalf. Kyle's lawyer started to object and the judge cut him off. She said she'd seen enough cases like this to know what she was looking at. She told Kyle that if he violated this order even once, he'd be arrested immediately. Then she asked if he understood. Kyle said yes in this cold, flat voice that made it clear he absolutely did not accept any of this. We left the courthouse and Annette actually started crying. Not sad crying, but relief crying. She kept saying she couldn't believe the judge had actually listened to her, had actually looked at the evidence and made a decision based on reality instead of Kyle's lies. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But 2 days later, Reggie called me. He'd been at work when he got an alert on his home security camera. Someone was in his driveway. When he pulled up the footage, it was Kyle, just standing there staring at Reggie's house. He didn't do anything, didn't approach the door or damage property. He just stood there for 3 minutes looking at the house where my brother's kids lived, then got back in his car and left. Reggie called the police immediately, showed them the footage, explained about the protective order and the threats. They said since Kyle hadn't technically violated the order, it only covered contact with Annette, not with her friend's family members. They couldn't arrest him. That's when I realized Kyle was trying to send a message. He couldn't get to Annette directly anymore, so he was making sure we all knew he could still reach the people we cared about. Annette wanted to go to the police about it, but Cassandra pointed out that we'd look like we were harassing him if we kept filing reports about things he was technically allowed to do. We needed to be smarter about this. So here's where we are now. Annette is staying with me temporarily until she can find her own place. She's working with a victim's advocate to prepare for the full protective order hearing next month. She's been applying for jobs under her real name for the first time in months. She's slowly starting to rebuild a life that isn't defined by running or hiding. Kyle hasn't contacted her directly since the courthouse, but he's been liking old photos on social media accounts. Mutual friends from Louisville who still follow both of them. Just enough to remind her he's still watching, still there. We're all just waiting to see what Kyle does next. And the thing that keeps me up at night is knowing that the protective order is just paper. It doesn't actually physically prevent Kyle from doing anything. It just means he'll face consequences if he does. But consequences only matter if you're alive to see them enforced. Edit. Someone in the comments asked if this is really over, and honestly, I don't know. I want to believe Kyle will eventually move on, find someone else to obsess over, leave Annette alone. But I also know men like him don't just give up when they lose control of something they think belongs to them.